Ricominciamo con i lavori. Abbiamo questa ultima sessione di convegno che è stata dedicata ad alcuni ospiti speciali che sono qui con noi oggi, che sono venuti a Modena in occasione del convegno e delle 2 giornate di play. Sono 2 ospiti molto speciali perché si occupano di gioco sotto forma di diverse accezioni e che ci racconteranno la loro esperienza, la loro pratica e le loro riflessioni sul tema del gioco e della realtà declinato ognuno a modo suo. Abbiamo le 2 presentazioni che saranno orientate su tematiche leggermente diverse. La nostra idea è che i nostri ospiti parleranno in inglese e abbiamo la possibilità di una traduzione semi-istantanea, nel senso subito dopo. Voi quanti capiscono bene l'inglese? Poi faremo delle domande per verificare se avete capito tutto, ovviamente. Bene, per cui first. Yes. Jason, please. You're welcome. As you wish. You can stand, you can sit, you can work there.
I'll be lazy. Well, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Jason Matthews. I'm an American game designer. I've designed Twilight Struggle and a number of other games of that sort of ilk. This is my second convention sort of like this. I attended one last year in Barcelona. And I have to say that I'm very impressed with what our European friends are doing in this regard. The Americans my countrymen are behind Europe when it comes to taking the cultural element of games seriously, the intellectual part of gaming seriously, that it is sort of an art form, it has a creative component to it. And I was very impressed last year by what was happening in Spain and how they were focused on that and how they took that very seriously. If you come to an American game convention, it'll be fun, but it won't have this element to it, really. Just a lot of overweight guys in t-shirts playing games, mostly. Which I'm sure I'll find some of that here in Italy as well. But the element of gaming that I have focused on, for those of you who have seen any of my games, has mostly been politics, or more particularly, the intersection between politics and conflict. My first game, Twilight Struggle, was on the Cold War, which for the most part did not really involve direct conflict between the 2 protagonists. So it has a very different sort of feel to it because it is about a political conflict. I come in the United States out of the American wargaming tradition. The wargaming tradition in the US gets its origins basically from 2 sources. One is very real, the Kriegspiel, what the Germans did with their general staff to practice for war. And the other was a little book written by an Englishman, H.G. Wells, called Little Wars, which was about miniature wargaming. Those 2 things eventually evolved into the hobby that I participated in. But there were a couple of things that were wrong with American wargaming, which is why it kind of went into a dead end and it stopped growing probably about, I would say 15 to 20 years ago, and became an increasingly a niche hobby in the United States. One of which is that it started taking itself too seriously. So American war games, not this one in the back behind me, but American war games will typically use NATO symbology, which is, it's kind of it's kind of cool, and it sort of makes you feel like you're fighting a war if you happen to know what the NATO unit standards mean, but it's not inviting for anybody else. If you're not already part of the hobby and you take a look at a chit with a strange round circle and strange unit designations on it, it doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever. And it also doesn't have a lot of historical authenticity to it. That approach to game design worked very well when we were designing games about NATO armies versus Warsaw Pact armies, which back in the 80s when I started playing war games, a lot of games were about that. But what sense does NATO unit symbology make for a game about the 30 Years' War or about the American Civil War? None of that was in existence when those conflicts were fought, and so it gives those games the wrong feel. The other thing that American war games don't do very well, or didn't do very well, was to explain politics, which is how I got into the niche that I am. What most American games that considered political elements did was they would have a random event chart. There would be a map with hexes, all the units that you usually move, and then somewhere stuck in the box there'd be a piece of paper with a chart on it, and you would roll a die, and that's how politics would be taken care of. Well, as most of you know, Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. And almost no war really has, almost no war is purely about military activity. All of them, even wars that are total wars like World War I and World War II, have enormous political components to them. And so a simple chart where you roll a die 6 to try and figure out how America was going to enter the war or under what circumstances, it just didn't make sense, and it didn't work very well. And so Mark Herman, who is another American game designer, came up with a little bit of an innovation that has gone crazy in the American hobby, which is, okay, we're not going to use those charts anymore. They don't make sense. Instead, we're going to use cards. And why do cards work so much better? Well, the good thing about cards when you're dealing with political situations is two things. First of all, you can write the rule right on the card. So instead of having a gigantic rule book of 100 pages that has 1,000 different exceptions for every political situation, you can just put the rule on the card, and then players can read the rule and implement the rule when it comes up. The other thing is that it added a huge degree of uncertainty, and that was really what was missing, because politics is about uncertainty. And in fact, that was the difficulty in American wargaming. If you go to the Pentagon these days, they're not sitting at a table with a big map pushing around a bunch of hexes. What they're doing looks a lot more like role-playing, because the thing that they're actually testing is your decision-making skills, not supposed outcomes. So Mark Herman helped me make the leap that if you can abstract military units, you can assign them abstract values of military strength, movement, all these other things that really are arbitrary. You can do the same thing with politics, because politics is another force that's a little bit of an abstraction. It's a little bit arbitrary. You can assign values to it just as you do military strength. And that's how Twilight Struggle started. So this game is about the entirety of the Cold War. We tried to focus on all of the major events, but the thing that someone told me that has always stayed with me, when you're trying to teach an historical lesson in a game, you have to make it obvious. It has to be a little bit like kabuki theater. All the gestures have to be big. The makeup has to be so big you can see it from the back row. Because if you make it too subtle and you make your points too subtly, the players will skip right over them. They won't get it. So Twilight Struggle, in a certain sense, is about a cartoon of the Cold War, because we take all of the preconceptions of the Cold War seriously. Like, for instance, the only thing that matters is the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. I know that's a nonsense, but it helps illustrate the broader point about what the nature of the Cold War was. We also take the domino theory seriously. Now, every political scientist in the United States will tell you the domino theory was never real. Countries don't fall like dominoes that way. But again, since it is an important element of the Cold War mindset, we include it in the game, and it's represented in the game to give people a flavor for what it is. So it's very weird being old enough now to design something that was so important, such an important part of my life, and then have kids play it and be like, oh, I never knew anything about this. But one of the most gratifying things about designing a game of this type is that it allows me to kind of instruct a little bit about the Cold War, explain to my own children what it was like facing the threat of nuclear holocaust, since they don't really know anything about it, and to say nothing of the Soviet Union, which had long disappeared by the time they were both born. So I think games of this nature that instruct on political conflict are a good way to teach history, and I'm going to keep working on that sort of game for a while. My next one, so there are supposedly 3 topics that you're not supposed to discuss in the United States: politics, religion, and sex. So I've done a lot of games on politics. My next game is on religion, so I think sex is coming up shortly thereafter. Thanks.